In the middle of the Sahara, there's a huge place where the land lies below sea level, and Egypt is planning to flood it. If you stand on the African coast of the Mediterranean and head about 50 miles into the Libyan desert, you'll find yourself in a massive depression. And I mean truly gigantic. Getting out of there wouldn't be easy. Its area is about 7,000 square miles, almost the size of New Jersey. I'm talking about the Sahara Depression, an enormous stretch of uninhabited desert with salt lakes and swamps. It's a hot, dry, and extremely harsh place, but that might soon change, because Egypt is planning to turn this desert into a sea. If the depression is filled with water to the right level, it'll become a huge body of water, about 7,700 square miles in size. That's just a bit smaller than Lake Winnipeg, the sixth largest freshwater lake in Canada. If the lake is created, Egypt could solve a whole bunch of problems that affect both the country and the continent as a whole. Looks like the world is about to witness a truly revolutionary project. Let's talk about it today. You can never have too much water. An unobtrusive reminder to do that thing under the video. Ever since the British first mapped the Depression after World War I, engineers haven't been able to let go of the idea of connecting it to the Mediterranean. Some suggested digging a canal, others wanted to bore a tunnel, and someone even suggested combining both, apparently so they wouldn't have to choose. But actually, the idea of using the Sahara Depression to generate electricity dates back to 1912. The idea was explored in more detail in 1927 by English geologist John Ball, who led the mapping of the area. He was the first to suggest turning the elevation difference between the sea and the depression into a source of hydropower, basically to make a giant power plant out of a sand pit. You see what I mean, right? Even the colonizers, greedy and pragmatic as they were, didn't see this desert as a useless patch of land. They actually thought about how to squeeze the most out of it. And make some money, of course. And then things took an unexpected turn. In 1957, the CIA brought President Eisenhower a document proposing to flood the Sahara Depression. Yes, you heard that right. The CIA had its eyes on it too. According to their calculations, if you let seawater in, it would form a massive lagoon, and the project would have four major advantages. First, it would look grand and peaceful. Second, it would change the local climate. Third, it would create jobs for years. And finally, once construction was over, people could actually live there. Starting in 1964, Frederick Bassler took charge. He headed an international advisory council tasked with figuring out how to implement the project and where to get the money. For nearly 10 years, Bassler was the main advocate of the Sahara Sea idea, but everything came down to money and complexity. Bringing seawater deep into the desert turned out incredibly expensive. Digging a canal or tunnel simply out of the question. On top of that, large areas would have to be cleared of landmines since northern Egypt is still littered with millions of unexploded shells left over from World War II, yet the plans were grand. One of Bassler's ideas was to use peaceful nuclear explosions, not for war, but as a kind of excavator for digging the canal. The plan was simple and shocking at the same time. Drill 213 shafts along the route and detonate a 1.5 megaton nuclear device in each. That's 1,500 kilotons, about 100 times the power of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. What could possibly go wrong, right? The idea fit perfectly into Eisenhower's 1953 Atoms for Peace program, back when nuclear energy was being promoted as something useful for construction and industry, not just as a weapon. But even with the friendliest slogans, the problems didn't go away. To pull off that many nuclear explosions, they'd have to evacuate a huge number of people, at least 25,000 by modest estimates. And the shockwaves from the blast could disturb the Red Sea Rift, which is only about 280 miles from the proposed site, a tectonically unstable area. In plain terms, there was a serious risk of triggering, well, say an earthquake? Another obvious downside was the potential change in ocean currents and shoreline destruction. If you interfere too much with the water movement in the region, waves and currents would start eroding coasts that had always been calm before. Eventually, even distant shorelines would be affected. And of course, there was the question of radioactivity. Wouldn't the new lake become radioactive after so many explosions? People asked this directly, but the half-joking replies like, "Oh, we'll just toss some iodine pills in the water," didn't help much. So it all ended as it did. Considering all these risks, the Egyptian government rejected the plan, and even the project's biggest supporters had to abandon it. Still, everyone admitted that using peaceful nuclear blasts would have drastically reduced costs. Traditional excavation was insanely expensive, but the price for that saving was way too high. Then years passed, and the idea got a second life, or maybe a third. Anyway, they decided to give it another try. Every now and then, scientists and engineers would circle back to the idea of flooding the Sahara Depression. It always seemed like the perfect solution from every angle: economic, climatic, even social. But no matter how many times the project was discussed, it never got past the talking stage. Still, in less than a century, interest in Sahara hasn't faded. The Egyptian authorities have tried more than once to revive the idea, but every attempt collapsed under the hard logic of numbers. Too expensive, too risky, too complicated. Every cost-benefit analysis said the same thing. Nope, not worth it. Finally, on April 11, 2023, Egypt signed a contract with EGIT Consulting to conduct a new study to evaluate whether the project could actually be brought to life. With fresh eyes, so to speak. The world has changed after all, and so have technologies. Maybe it's time to redo the math. So the gist of it is that the desert has to be cut through. Sounds manageable until you start doing the math. According to the plan, they'd have to carve a massive canal or drill a tunnel stretching anywhere from 34 to 60 miles, depending on the route to the Mediterranean Sea. Seawater would then flow directly into the Sahara Depression. But the problem isn't just the length. To the north, the depression runs into the El Difa Plateau, a rocky ridge separating the desert from the sea. It doesn't look that high, only about 660 feet above sea level, but that's more than enough to make construction even harder. Cutting a sea level passage through solid rock is an extreme engineering challenge. It's the kind of project people name after themselves and brag about for decades. You could say it's a life's work, not just one phase of a larger plan. And then there's the desert itself, a tricky, unpredictable place for construction. The ground either crumbles or collapses. Loose sands and sticky clay can clog pumps, cave in trench walls, and turn construction into a constant battle with the soil. Every single foot has to be clawed out of the earth, and the earth fights back. Still, there are possible solutions, as cutting a sea-level canal through the El Difa Plateau isn't the only way. With modern tunnel boring machines, it'd be possible to dig one or several tunnels, but under the plateau. That's not cheap, of course, but doable. Or another option would be to lay a pipeline northeast, all the way to the Nile. Though that would be a long one, at least 199 miles. And that's when I realized that maybe it's time to focus on the drilling machines. After all, we need to understand what exactly they're planning to dig the desert with, right? In recent decades, projects like this have used special tunnel boring machines, massive structures that literally chew through the ground. Up front, they have a rotating cutting head that presses against the rock, crushing and breaking it apart. Everything that's left after the drilling automatically moves backward. If you picture one of those things, it's not just a drill, it's a whole underground factory on rails. One such monster is as long as 14 London buses and weighs as much as 143 of them. Thanks to these machines, humanity has learned to build underground with ease. They've changed the economy, the environment, and even culture. Because tunnels, like bridges, connect not only shores, but people on those shores. Many of the world's most famous tunnels wouldn't exist without these giant boring machines. Modern models can dig through dozens of feet of rock per day, and Egypt, by the way, already has experience with them. Tunnel boring machines were used during the construction of tunnels under the Suez Canal. They picked a model with an internal diameter of 37 feet and an external one of 41 feet, which, just so you know, is about the height of a 4-story building. Another such machine was used when laying the Cairo Metro. 2 tunnels nearly 12 miles long were lined with concrete rings 19 feet in diameter. The digging depth ranged from 24 to 131 feet below ground. In short, Egypt already has the experience, the machinery, and the specialists who know how to operate this kind of equipment under conditions very similar to what awaits engineers in the Sahara Depression. The good news is that after all that digging, the water won't even need pumps to reach the future basin. The Sahara Depression lies about 197 feet below sea level, roughly the height of a 20-story building, but going down. Right now, it's just a vast, sun-scorched desert with no water and no people. If it were connected to the Mediterranean via a canal or a system of tunnels, seawater could be brought in. There's a catch: the heat, which would make the water evaporate at a terrifying rate. Yet that's the whole point of the idea. If the inflow and evaporation are balanced, it creates a constant flow, meaning a current that can generate electricity. Essentially, the desert would turn into a giant natural power plant. The only thing left is to make precise calculations. The Nile has been nearly drained of its energy potential. Ever since the famous Aswan Dam was completed back in 1968, every bit of hydropower upstream has already been tapped. But Egypt keeps growing. Its demand for electricity rising, and the country is desperate for a new major source of power. The Qatar project could be just that: cheap electricity, a massive boost for the entire economy. The idea is to make the difference in altitude work for you. Brilliant and simple. The key, though, is balance. The rate at which water flows into the depression must match the rate at which it evaporates under the sun. According to calculations, 10 years after the flooding begins, the water level would stabilize. And the climate there's perfect for it: dry and rainless. Evaporation happens so fast that the inflow of seawater could be maintained almost indefinitely. According to the plan, the first power station, Qatar 1, conceived back in the mid-20th century, was supposed to produce 670 megawatts. In the second stage, the output would increase by another 1,200 megawatts, and with the addition of a pumped storage plant, a system where water cycles up and down, the total capacity could reach 4,000 more megawatts. Altogether, that's around 5,800 megawatts, roughly equivalent to 6 modern nuclear reactors. There's another option: to build an artificial reservoir on the plateau above the depression, basically a giant water tank. At a depth of about 197 feet below sea level, an underground power station with a system of sluices would be installed, some letting water in, others releasing it. The station was designed to have 2 sets of equipment. The first would include regular turbo generators that produce electricity when water flows down the tunnel into the lake. The second, pump turbine motor generators that can work both ways, pumping water up and then letting it run back down again. The system is called a pumped storage power plant. In simple terms, it's a giant battery. There are 2 reservoirs, upper and lower. When there's too much electricity in the grid and it's cheap, the water's pumped upward. When electricity is in short supply and prices go up, the water is released back down. And as it passes through turbines, it generates power. It's a double win. The system uses surplus energy that would otherwise be wasted, and it helps cover shortages during peak demand. The output of such a station can be adjusted to meet specific needs. For Qatar, the base capacity is estimated at about 315 megawatts, but during peak hours it could reach as high as 1,500. It all depends on how long you need to maintain high loads and how much power goes into pumping the water back up. And on top of that, you could even turn seawater into fresh water. Instead of sending electricity all the way along power lines to the Nile Delta, part of that energy could be used to produce fresh water right from the sea. The idea is quite simple. Water from the Mediterranean flows into the lake, and due to pressure differences, it passes through filters and reverse osmosis plants. The salt stays on one side of the membrane, and on the other you get pure, fresh water. This method's already used all over the world, and in Egypt it'd be especially useful. Almost the entire economy depends on irrigation, while the climate keeps getting drier every year. There's another way too: using the generated electricity for desalination by electrodialysis. That's when water is purified not through filters, but by electric current, which separates salts and water into ions. But the result's the same: an extra source of fresh water right in the middle of the desert. Pretty cool. You don't even have to look far for an example. In neighboring Israel, about 90% of all desalinated water is produced by 5 large plants along the Mediterranean coast. These plants supply around half of all drinking water in the country. Egypt is also moving actively in this direction. Right now, the country operates 125 desalination facilities with a combined output of over 343 million gallons per day. And more are on the way. The government plans to reach 2.4 billion gallons a day by 2050. And if all this is tied together with the Qatar project, we'd get not just a power plant, but a true source of life for vast territories. And even a source of salt. Wait, what? If the Qatar project ever comes to life, a huge lake will appear where now there's scorched desert. Settlements will grow around it, and people will start doing Well, something useful, like mining salt, for example. But one thing needs to be understood: the climate will still be desert. The water will evaporate quickly, and over time the lake will turn hypersaline, basically into a giant salt pond. The depression will gradually return to what it once was, only the bottom will rise by dozens of feet due to all the deposited salts. But salt isn't the only thing to extract. In 2024, Saudi Arabia and the UAE already began exploring ways to extract lithium from salt deposits. This metal is essential for electric car batteries, and demand for it is simply huge right now. So even if regular salt mining doesn't bring much profit, the project could still turn into a gold mine. Or rather, a lithium one. If the Qatar Depression really gets flooded, it could become not only a source of energy and fresh water, but also a place where a key resource of the new energy era is mined. Sounds awesome. So what else is on the agenda? If everything works out, the lake will eventually change the region's climate completely, making it cooler and more humid. By mid-century, Qatar could turn from a scorched, lifeless desert into a fertile region where tens of millions of people could live. It would also provide jobs for millions of young Egyptians, which is especially important given the high unemployment rate. Economists and environmental scientists have already studied how realistic the project is. According to their calculations, it should be both profitable and environmentally sustainable. As water flows into the depression, it'll evaporate, increasing humidity and even rainfall. A large lake will appear, and with it, a massive fish farm, new food sources, and protection of the soil from wind erosion. But the ripple effects could reach even further. Developing the Qatar Depression could boost exports and imports, revive tourism, increase political activity in the region. In short, make everything better without making anything worse. It's kind of amazing that even today, with all our science and technology, life still starts with water. With it, we can generate electricity, irrigate land, and build new settlements around it. Agricultural, industrial, urban, and tourist ones. All this is part of a grand development plan stretching from South El Alamein to South Salem. The idea is that about 34 million people could live here over the next 40 years. Today, Egypt depends heavily on food imports. The country balances that by developing its industry, exporting goods to pay for the food it buys. Local resources such as cotton, wheat, sugarcane, and fruit have already driven growth in the processing sector. And mining of iron ore, manganese, oil, phosphates, and gold has powered heavy industries. If the Qatar project really comes to life, it could become a continuation of the great step that once began with the construction of the Aswan High Dam. Only this time, Egypt isn't just building a dam, it's creating a whole new sea in the middle of the desert. That got me wondering, if they actually built a canal, could ships use it? In theory, I mean. So I started digging for information. Turns out pumping seawater through pipes across the El Difa Plateau wouldn't turn the Qatar Depression into a true sea. Ships wouldn't be able to travel through those pipes, except maybe tiny toy ones. But if the project takes off and cities, factories, and farms really start to appear in the area, the question of navigation will naturally come up. That's when people would start thinking about building a real sea-level canal. The main problem isn't that such a canal would be impossible to build. On the contrary, technically it's quite doable, just incredibly expensive. To dig it, you'd have to remove a colossal amount of rock, between 35 and 70 billion cubic feet. Sounds insane, but in reality that's several times less than what the world's largest open pit mines extract every year. For comparison, in the Powder River Coal Basin in Wyoming, the same volume of rock gets stripped away in just 2 years. They will also need to do some digging near the canal's outlet, the place where it meets the sea. You could even build a deepwater harbor there, so large ships could come in. Such a port would become a logistics hub, distributing goods to towns and settlements around the future lake. Big container ships and tankers would dock directly in the harbor without any locks. And then, through a network of smaller canals linking settlements within the Qatar area, the cargo could be delivered by smaller boats. The difference in elevation between the port and the inland waters would require locks or special ship lifts, but they'd be relatively small, nothing like the ones used for ocean-going vessels. All in all, it sounds nice and very expensive. A bit like a sci-fi vision of the future. But again, building all this is absolutely possible. No alien tech needed. We already know how to do it. And with the world becoming less dependent on gas lately, that would only work in Egypt's favor. Today, Egypt still relies almost entirely on fossil fuels. In 2023, oil, gas, and fuel oil made up 88% of all electricity produced, and by 2024, the share even grew a bit to 89%. Egypt is actually Africa's leader in power generation from gas. In 2022, it accounted for almost half, 45% of all gas electricity on the continent. Over the past 20 years, domestic demand has more than doubled. I've already mentioned the reason: population growth, expanding cities, and industry. For now, the backbone of the system is natural gas. Its share in 2023 was 84%. That's what Egypt relied on for a long time, especially after discovering large fields like Zohr in the Mediterranean. For a while, the country even became a gas exporter and felt like an energy hub of the region. But gas fields tend to run dry. When production started to fall, Egypt had to import fuel, liquefied natural gas, diesel, and fuel oil. All that is expensive, and the costs hit the national budget hard. And then again, and again, because imports of liquefied gas in the second quarter of 2025 soared to 62 billion cubic feet compared to just 3.5 billion a year earlier. So dependence on foreign supplies keeps growing, and prices aren't going down. And that's bad news either way, because energy dependence is risky for any country. Usually, states try to do the opposite, become self-sufficient, switch to domestic energy sources, and stop relying on someone else's gas or oil. And guess where I'm going with this? The Qatar project might just be a step in that direction. Right now, Egypt's hydroelectric plants generate only about 7% of the country's energy. Another 5% comes from wind and solar power. That's definitely more than the meager 1% back in 2015, but still below the global average, roughly 13%. But Egypt is trying to catch up. By 2030, the country plans to get 42% of its electricity from clean sources like the sun and the wind. The backbone of Egypt's hydropower today consists of 4 major stations: the Old Aswan Dam, the Esna Dam, the High Aswan Dam, and the Nag Hammadi Dam. In 2016, a new station joined them, the one on the Asyut Dam. If the Qatar project ever comes to life, it would become the 5th in this list, and by far the most unusual. The High Aswan Dam still provides almost all of Egypt's hydroelectric power with a theoretical capacity of around 2.1 gigawatts. But when the Nile's water level drops, the station can't run at full strength. That's why Egypt urgently needs new sources to back up and complement its aging system. And while the Qatar Depression project is still stuck at the discussion and calculation stage, there are others. They are already running and helping the country, if not move confidently toward green energy, then, well, at least lean in the right direction. One of my favorites is the Sharq El Awainat project. More than 95% of Egypt's land is desert. Essentially, all life here is concentrated along a narrow strip of the Nile. The rest is a sea of sand. There's barely any land suitable for farming. Yet the population keeps growing, and people still need to eat. So in recent years, Egypt has been learning how to create life in the desert. In a photo taken by an astronaut from the International Space Station, you can see what looks like a pattern of giant green circles. Those are the agricultural fields of Sharq El Awainat in the southwest of Egypt. Just imagine, right in the middle of the Sahara, hundreds of miles from the nearest city, surrounded by sand and rock, perfect circles of greenery. The secret lies underground. Beneath the Sahara lies the vast Nubian sandstone aquifer, an ancient layer of rock that collected fresh water millions of years ago. It's what keeps these farms alive. For people living far from the Nile, it's the only source of water. There's no rainfall here at all. The yearly average is basically zero. So the entire system is built on precise, efficient irrigation. And the circular shape isn't accidental, it's all about center pivot irrigation. In the middle of each circle is a well, from which water is pumped into long pipes that rotate around like clock hands. That's how water is sprayed evenly across the field. Each of those circles is huge, almost 2,600 feet across. The soil isn't perfect, but the deep water is almost salt-free, which makes it perfect for growing just about anything. The fields mainly grow potatoes, the dark green circles wheat, the light brown ones the aromatic herbs like chamomile. The reddish circles are plots that were burned intentionally to clear the soil for new crops. Everything grown here travels by desert roads to the oasis of Dakhla and Abu Simbel or gets exported through the nearest airport. The Shark El Awanet project actually began long ago, back in 1991, as a desperate attempt to turn part of the desert into farmland. Today, it's run by the National Company for Land Reclamation and Agriculture under Egypt's armed forces. In 2021, the project was expanded from the original 172 square miles to an additional 2,180 to produce even more food and chamomile. You owe me a like. See you later.